Ethan Miller was 15 when he first stood alone on the strip of land that technically belonged to him. It wasn't much, just a narrow stretch of rocky hillside on the edge of a small Montana settlement where the wind never seemed to rest. The mountains rose like silent walls in the distance, already dusted with early snow. Winter was coming fast. Everyone in town could feel it in their bones. Ethan hadn't planned to be alone out there. His father had died the previous spring in a logging accident, crushed beneath a falling pine. After that, there was no family left to take him in. A distant relative arranged the paperwork, and suddenly Ethan had a plot of land and a warning. Build something before the cold hits. Most men in the valley built the same way. Square wooden cabins, tall walls, heavy roofs, big fireplaces. They chopped trees all summer and stacked firewood higher than their shoulders. But Ethan didn't have the strength for that kind of work. His arms were still thin, his shoulders still narrow. Each swing of the axe felt like lifting a stone that didn't want to move. So instead of cutting trees, Ethan picked up a shovel. He chose a south-facing slope and began digging straight into the earth. Day after day, he carved out a shallow room from clay and stone, piling the dirt beside him like a growing wall. He stacked rocks for the front face and packed wet soil between them with careful, patient hands. The roof he covered with sod and grass, pressing it down until it looked like part of the hill itself. To the people who passed by, it looked wrong. Looks like a badger hole, one man muttered from his horse. Another laughed. Kids building his own grave. Ethan heard them all. The jokes traveled faster than the wind. At the general store, men shook their heads. At church, women whispered with worried eyes. A carpenter rode out just to inspect it and left 10 minutes later saying, "That thing won't last one storm." Ethan pretended not to care, but the words stayed with him. At night, lying on a thin blanket inside the half-finished shelter, he stared at the low ceiling and felt doubt crawl into his chest. The walls smelled of wet earth. The wind howled outside like something alive. Sometimes he wondered if they were right, if he really was too young, too foolish, too stubborn. But he kept working. He shaped a small firebox from brick and stone. He cut a narrow window into the front wall to catch the winter sun. He smoothed the sleeping platform with a flat rock his father once used as a sharpening stone. Every movement was slow and deliberate, as if the hill itself were watching him. By the time the first hard frost arrived, Ethan's house was finished. It was low, it was dark, and it looked nothing like a real home. Yet when he stepped inside and closed the door, the wind vanished. For the first time since his father died, the world felt quiet. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and loneliness, a fragile belief began to form. Maybe this strange little house could keep him alive. The first real snow came in early November. It didn't stay long, but it was enough to remind everyone what was waiting. Men in town hurried to finish their cabins, hauling the last stacks of firewood to their doors. Smoke rose from chimneys every evening, thin and blue against the gray sky. Ethan watched it all from his hillside. From a distance, his shelter looked like part of the land itself. Grass still clung to the roof. Frost settled on it like sugar. If you didn't know where to look, you'd walk right past it. Inside, the air was different. Not warm, yet, but calmer. The wind that screamed across the valley never reached him. Still, doubt followed him like a shadow. He had built with dirt, stone instead of timber. He had trusted his father's old words instead of the ways of grown men. And now winter was almost here. One afternoon, a neighbor named Thomas Reed rode up the slope and stopped in front of the low stone wall. "You really gonna stay in there?" the man asked, squinting at the doorway. Ethan nodded. "It's all I've got." Thomas dismounted and stepped closer, eyeing the sod roof. "That ground's gonna turn to ice. You'll wake up frozen stiff." Ethan swallowed. "The earth stays warmer than the air." Thomas snorted. "That's not how houses work, son." The words hit harder than Ethan expected. That night he lay awake listening to the wind scrape over the hill. He imagined the cold creeping through the walls, imagined the roof collapsing under heavy snow. His chest tightened with a quiet fear he didn't want to name. For a moment he considered leaving. There was a barn 2 miles away where he might beg for a corner of hay. There was a family in town who might take pity on him for a few weeks. Pride told him not to ask. Survival told him maybe he should. But then he thought of his father. Not his face, but his voice. Calm, certain. Dig down if you want warmth. The ground doesn't care about storms. So Ethan made changes instead of running. He carved shallow channels in the dirt outside the front wall to guide melting snow away from the entrance. He packed the roof tighter, layering sod and clay until it felt solid beneath his boots. He widened the tiny vent above the firebox, shaping it with careful hands so smoke could escape without letting heat rush out. Every improvement cost him effort he barely had left. His palms split and bled, his shoulders burned. But with each small fix, the shelter felt more real, less like a hole in the ground, and more like something built with purpose. Still, the talk didn't stop. At the store, someone said, "That kid won't make it to Christmas." Another replied, "Nature'll teach him what books can't." Ethan didn't argue. He kept his eyes down and his shovel moving. By the time December arrived, the hills were white and the nights were long. His shelter was finished, but his confidence was not. When he lit his first real fire and felt the faint warmth rise, it wasn't victory he felt. It was tension. Because now there was no more building to do. No more fixing. No more pretending winter was still far away. All that was left was to wait. The storm came without ceremony. One night, the wind rose like an angry voice outside Ethan's shelter, rattling the stones in the front wall. By morning, the sky had turned the color of dirty wool. Snow fell in thick, heavy sheets that erased the trail leading down to town. The temperature dropped fast, so fast that the creek below the hill crusted over in a single afternoon. Ethan stood in the doorway and felt the cold bite his face. The air burned his lungs. Somewhere beyond the white blur, chimneys were already smoking, families feeding their fires like nervous animals. He stepped back inside and shut the door. At first, he built a proper fire. The small firebox glowed orange, and the walls caught a faint warmth. He sat close to it, hands stretched out, boots steaming as the snow melted from them. The shelter smelled of damp earth and smoke. Outside, the wind howled as if trying to pull the hill apart. By the second day, the storm worsened. Snow piled against the stone front wall. The roof disappeared beneath a thick white blanket. Ethan kept the fire going through the night, waking every few hours to feed it another stick. His eyes burned from smoke, and his throat felt raw. He thought of the men in town with their tall cabins and roaring stoves. "They know what they're doing," he told himself. "I don't." On the third night, exhaustion caught him. He let the fire die down to glowing coals and wrapped himself in his blanket. The silence felt heavy, broken only by the distant roar of the wind outside. He waited for the cold to creep in, to crawl through the walls and claim the room. It didn't. The air stayed still. Not warm, but not cruel either. The dirt walls felt cool under his palm, yet strangely steady, as if they were holding something back. He pulled the blanket tighter and slept. When he woke, it was dark. He touched the stones near the firebox. They were still faintly warm. Outside, the storm kept raging. In town, the story was different. Men split wood until their hands blistered. Children slept in coats. Some families burned fence boards when their piles ran low. Smoke hung over the valley day and night. And with every passing hour, someone would ask, "What about that boy on the hill?" No one went to check. The road was buried, the wind cut like a knife. By the fifth day, people stopped talking about Ethan as if he were alive. They said things like, "It was foolish to let a kid try that." They said, "Nature always wins." Up on the hillside, Ethan listened to the wind scrape across his roof and wondered if the same thing. His stomach twisted with fear. Sometimes the walls creaked. Sometimes snow slid down the front stones with a dull thud. He imagined the roof giving way, imagined the cold rushing in like water. He kept his fire small now, just enough to take the edge off the chill. He noticed something strange. When the flames died, the room didn't freeze. It cooled slowly, like it was breathing instead of collapsing. One night, when the storm was loudest, he pressed his back against the dirt wall and felt it. Solid, unmoving, almost warm compared to the air. For the first time since the storm began, he felt something other than fear. He felt hope, not the kind that shouts, the quiet kind that whispers, "Maybe you were right." The storm broke on the seventh day. The wind softened first, dropping from a howl to a tired whistle. Then the snow stopped falling, leaving the valley buried under a smooth, endless white. Smoke still rose from the town, but thinner now, as if the fires themselves were running out of strength. That morning, Thomas Reed saddled his horse. He hadn't slept much during the storm. His cabin had stayed standing, but the cold had worked its way through every crack. His youngest son had cried all night, and Thomas had burned more wood in 1 week than he usually did in a month. As he tied the reins, a thought wouldn't leave him alone. What about the boy? The trail to Ethan's hillside was half gone, but Thomas forced the horse through the drifts. When he crested the last rise, he stopped short. There was no sign of collapse, no broken roof, no dark shape frozen in the doorway. Instead, a thin line of smoke drifted upward from the hill, faint but steady. Thomas dismounted and walked the rest of the way. He knocked once, then again. The door opened. Ethan stood there in his wool shirt, hair dry, cheeks flushed with color. Not blue, not stiff, alive. You all right? Thomas asked. Ethan nodded. Yes, sir. Warm air brushed Thomas's face as he stepped inside. It wasn't hot, but it was calm and gentle, like the inside of a quiet room rather than a shelter in a storm. The firebox held only dull coals. No roaring flames. No piles of wood stacked beside it. You been burning this whole time? Thomas asked. Not much, Ethan said. Just mornings. And sometimes at night. Thomas reached out and pressed his hand against the back wall. It felt cool but not icy. Solid. Holding something inside. How? He asked. Ethan hesitated, then spoke simply. The ground keeps the cold out. It doesn't change fast, so I only have to warm the air a little. Thomas didn't answer right away. He looked around. The low ceiling, the packed earth, the narrow window catching pale sunlight. Everything he'd mocked now made sense in a way he didn't want to admit. By afternoon, word spread. Men who had spent the storm feeding their stoves came to see the shelter for themselves. One brought a thermometer. Outside, the air still bit hard. Inside, the needle climbed higher than anyone expected. Someone muttered, "That's not possible." Someone else said nothing at all. They stood there in silence, staring at the dirt walls like they were something new. Ethan felt their eyes on him, heavy and uncertain. He waited for laughter, for the jokes to start again. They didn't. Instead, questions came. How deep did you dig? What did you pack the roof with? How much wood you burn? When he answered, truthfully, the room grew quieter. That evening, as the men rode back toward town, the jokes didn't follow them. What followed was something stranger. Respect. Not loud, not proud. Just a slow, uncomfortable realization that a 15-year-old boy, working alone with dirt and stone, had found a way to outlast a winter that had beaten grown men with axes and wagons. And Ethan, standing in the doorway as the last horse disappeared down the hill, felt something shift inside him. For the first time since his father died, he wasn't just surviving, he was being seen. The rest of winter did not suddenly turn kind. More snow came. The nights stayed long, but something in the valley had shifted. People no longer spoke about Ethan Miller as the boy who had built a foolish hole in the ground. They spoke about him as the boy who had stayed warm when no one thought he could. A week after the storm, Thomas Reed returned. Not alone this time. 2 other men came with him, carrying shovels instead of jokes. We're not here to laugh, Thomas said awkwardly. We're here to learn. They studied the slope. They measured how far Ethan had dug into the hill. They pressed their palms against the dirt walls like they were touching a living thing. One man muttered, "All this time, and we never thought of using the ground itself." By February, changes appeared across the valley. Some families piled earth against the north side of their cabins. Others added sod to their roofs. One man dug a small winter room into the hillside and moved his family into it during the coldest weeks. They burned less wood. They slept better. The fires didn't roar all night anymore. They whispered. And through it all, Ethan stayed quiet. He did not give speeches. He did not claim to be smarter than anyone. He only answered when asked. He only showed what he had done. In the evenings, he still sat alone in his shelter, listening to the wind move over the hill like a distant river. Sometimes he thought about his father, not with the sharp pain of loss, but with something steadier. He imagined telling him what had happened, that men with beards and heavy boots had come to learn from a boy who once could barely lift an axe, that the house everyone mocked had become a lesson written in snow and dirt. Spring arrived slowly. The creek broke open. The sod on Ethan's roof turned green again. From a distance, his home looked like part of the hillside, quiet, stubborn, and alive. One evening, as the sun slid down behind the mountains, Ethan stood outside and looked over the valley. Smoke still rose from chimneys, but thinner now. The crisis had passed. What remained was something harder to name. Understanding. Not every tradition was wrong, but not every tradition was right either. Sometimes survival didn't come from doing what everyone else had always done. Sometimes it came from asking a different question. Instead of, How do I fight the cold? Ethan had asked. How do I live with it? And that made all the difference. So now I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? What is the coldest winter you've ever lived through? And if you had to survive it with nothing but your own hands and your own ideas, what would you build? Drop your answer in the comments. I read everyone. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that wisdom doesn't always come from strength or age, then subscribe to the channel. Because every week we tell stories about people who were underestimated, people who were laughed at, and people who quietly proved everyone wrong. Sometimes the smartest way forward isn't louder, isn't bigger, isn't faster. Sometimes it's just a boy, a shovel, and the courage to think differently.